In this week's video, I'll be going over 5 tips for repetition throwing, which, as it sounds, is simply the process of making pots that are identical to one another. It's a skill that can be picked up quickly, but it can take a really long time to master, and hopefully this video, with the tips included, might help you out with your own throwing. And we're starting out with what is probably the most basic and fundamental step, the clay prep. If you think about it, if your aim is to throw pots that are more or less identical to one another, then your most basic material, the clay you're using, needs to be in the perfect condition. If you attempt to throw pots with clay that's either far too firm or far too soft, you'll likely only make the process more difficult for yourself. But perhaps more importantly, when you are making pots that have the exact same dimensions, then accurately weighing out your clay can make a vast difference. Of course, there's a period of learning where all you're trying to do is get a basic understanding and feel for the clay, so the weight itself isn't really that important. But as soon as your aim becomes that of throwing identical pots, then being strict with your measured weights is crucial, unless of course you're learning to throw pots off the hump, but that's something we'll discuss later. Being accurate and strict with yourself, whilst perhaps a bit daunting at the start, is crucially important, and it can lead to really rapid improvement. I think it's also worth sourcing a list of recommended throwing weights for different types of pots, be it bowls, mugs, plates, teapots, or even oven dishes. This can all be exceedingly useful, as I think there's a tendency when you're first learning how to make pots to use far more clay than you really should be using, which inevitably leads to throwing pots which are much heavier than they need be. The next tip is having something to aim for as you're throwing. And this is something you'll see me doing quite a lot as I'm throwing, flicking up and down this little rubber pointer. This is my throwing gauge. It's screwed in place into the table that sits just behind my wheel, and it's lined up so the rubber pointer is perfectly in line with the center of the wheel. So when it comes to throwing a batch of identical pots, I initially throw the first piece and simply measure it using a ruler. And once I'm happy with the dimensions, I spend a few moments setting the point of my throwing gauge so that it rests just next to the rim. And the reason you see me flicking it up and down like this quite a lot is just to ensure that it falls back into the exact same place time and time again. The fact that the pointer can flick out of the way like this is incredibly useful, as it means I can slide the wire underneath without colliding with it. It also provides me with some space for when I need to carefully grasp the pot and lift it away. Having a point that's made from a soft material is useful too, as it means the pot can knock into the pointer without the clay work being damaged. It may score a soft line into it, but otherwise it'll just bounce harmlessly off it. But essentially, what a throwing gauge gives me is a point in space in which to aim for as I pull the walls of clay upward, and it makes for a far more efficient method as compared to measuring each one by hand with a ruler. But more than anything, it's having that target to aim for. And I suppose you could train your eye to throw the same shape time and time again without the aid of any tools, but doing so can take years of practice. And whilst I can more or less do that with some shapes, I still much prefer to have the throwing gauge there to guide me. So accordingly, I do have a bias to a throwing gauge like this, as it's how I was taught. But essentially, you can use anything that's long and pointy, which is shoved into a block of clay and set to the measurement of the pot you're throwing. It'll do more or less the same job, although it'll need constant readjusting and correcting. There are, of course, also other, more technologically advanced methods, such as the laser level, as used by Joe Thompson of Old Forge Creations, which, when combined with the measuring chart, as seen at the beginning, can be a very quick and efficient way of setting up the measurement that you need to throw to. So thanks Joe for this footage, and make sure you go and check his channel out. Ultimately, as long as you have a point in space to aim for as you're making, throwing pots repetitively just becomes that much easier. Without one, you sort of are just throwing blind. I'm sure there are people who do that, and power to them, but I personally like having a point, an adjustable target, so that I can throw the walls of the pot evenly to it. Perhaps one day I should try out this laser method, but I think personally I prefer having a physical point to aim for. There is another option too, which is this, a tombo. I made this one myself during my apprenticeship with Ken Matsuzaki in Mashiko, Japan. The vertical length sits down inside your pot and marks the depth, whereas the horizontal beam measures the diameter of your pot. These are useful tools, and you can throw very accurately with them, especially if the interior dimensions of your pots need to be completely identical each time. But they are more suited for when you throw off the hump, which this footage I filmed back in 2019 during my apprenticeship shows. Here I learnt how to use a kick wheel and throw Yonomi teacups by the 100. As you're using one large block of clay and you only ever use the topmost portion to throw the cup, the amount of clay steadily declines as you work your way through it, getting lower and lower, and in this instance you need a tombo, as the set dimensions can be used to measure a pot, no matter the height it's at on the wheel. Whereas using a tombo on a wheel like this, when you could be using a throwing gauge, is sort of pointless, as you'd keep having to pick it up and check the measurement, whereas with the throwing gauge's pointer, the measurement is continually there, and, like I've said so many times now, there's that physical target you can aim for. My third piece of advice has to do with the rims of the pots you throw. I think, as a beginner, when first attempting to make pots that are identical, the focus tends to lie on the overall form of the pot, and often the rims themselves are a little bit overlooked, when, in fact, so much of the information you take in when looking at a pot is through that of the rim of the vessel. It may only seem like a small portion of the pot, but if one of the rims here was notably different, it would stick out like a sore thumb. And I don't just mean the shape the lip has, whether it's beveled outward, blocky, or razor sharp. They also need to all have the same strength, be thrown with the same consistency, and with the same amount of clay in that portion of the pot. Getting this right adds a strong unity to all of the pieces. But there's also a functional purpose too, or perhaps an ergonomic one. If the functional purpose of a vessel is to be used to drink from, then the lip itself really needs to be considered. For instance, this blocky, sharp edge wouldn't fit comfortably into the corners of your mouth. And I hate to say it, but a blocky lip like this really is a characteristic of a pot made with not much thought, especially for a drinking vessel. The same can be said about a rim that instead of sloping outwards, slopes inwards, like so. For a drinking vessel, the perception this lip gives just doesn't come across as being nice to drink from. It encloses and hides the contents, and doesn't come across as being particularly welcoming, whereas a lip that slopes outward, like so, coming to a beveled point that meets the outside edge of the wall, is immediately more welcoming. It's offering its contents, and a curved shape like this fits very comfortably into the corners of your mouth as you take a drink from it. But the reason I'm telling you all of this is because if you are repetition throwing, you need to pick one type of rim and you have to stick with it, as opposed to throwing a batch of pots where the forms of the pots are all the same, but the rims differ from each vessel, some being blocky, others beveled inward, and some beveled outward. If you're throwing a batch of pots that are all made to be identical, then the rims need to be identical too. My fourth tip is to look, and I mean really look at what it is you're making. Often in my videos you'll see that I sit with a mirror opposite myself on the throwing wheel. It allows me to see the pot not only from this top view, which would be the only view you'd have without it, but also this side view. I can't overemphasize how useful I find this, as it makes it far easier to see the actual shape of the pot as I'm throwing it. I don't have to lean back awkwardly like so in order to see a poor side view of it and also strain my back. Instead, I can simply just glance up and see a perfect side view. This is another technique I've used ever since it was taught to me, and without a mirror, I really do feel as if I'm missing a sense. But beyond using a mirror, just looking at your pots and really gauging if they're identical or not is good practice in itself. Eliminate those that stand out, and gradually, over time, your forms will become more and more similar to one another. This is the view I have as I throw, but it's also equally useful when it comes to trim pots too. And sometimes I even find myself throwing entire pots looking in the mirror, and more often than not, it's through the mirror that I watch the pointer, as through this side view you can very easily see if the pointer and the rim of the pot are level, as compared to the view you'd have normally when looking at the pot from above. But being critical of your work and teaching yourself to really look at the form of your pots is so important, and being okay with destroying pots that don't make the grade is a vital lesson you need to learn as a potter. Don't be too precious, and remember that this is a recyclable material. As one of my tutors used to say, there are already too many bad pots in the world, so not everything needs to be kept and fired and made permanent. Which leads nicely into my final tip, which is to simply just practice. Learning to throw bowls and mugs and teapots that are all identical is a process that can take years, so just keep throwing. And sometimes throw for the sake of just throwing. You don't need to keep every single piece you make. And sometimes spending an afternoon throwing basic cylinders as tall as you can until the clay buckles and collapses can be fantastic practice. I've been making pots for more than a decade now, and I can't tell you how many tens of thousands there are in existence, be it the pots I made in college, those for the soda-fied standardware range at Mayshill Pottery, or the endless Yunomi teacups I made in Mashiko, Japan. And just like anything else, such as learning an instrument or a foreign language, you've just got to practice and really invest your time into it. I know this tip doesn't share a technical snippet that might help you, but I think it is a very important thing to hear and remember, is once you gain a true fluency in throwing and with this craft, and you have some things mastered, that's when you can let go and be more creative, but with the underpinning of quality and craftsmanship that remains. Of course, that's just my ethos. That's the way I learned, and I hope some of the tips shared in this video may end up being useful for you too. And as the original YouTube potter Simon Leach says, keep practicing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.